than 75% enslaved. The region represented one of the most productive plantation areas in the state, sustaining the cotton economy that fed both the North and Europe. It was in this setting that the Ross plantation operated as one of the most prosperous properties in the area. But behind the facade of respectability, events were unfolding that would reveal the darkest depths of human nature. A story that began with a son discovering his father's dead body would transform into an investigation that would expose a network of corruption, violence, and injustice that would shake the foundations of the local community. This is one of the most disturbing stories I've ever heard about how greed and power can corrupt even the most sacred family bonds. An investigation that would reveal that sometimes those who appear to be victims are, in truth, the true architects of tragedy. Before we continue, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And if this is your first time here on the channel, don't forget to subscribe for more stories that explore the darkest mysteries of the past. The Ross plantation stretched across more than 2,000 acres along the banks of the Alabama River, its fertile lands producing cotton that fed textile factories in the North and Europe. Carlton Ross, a 52-year-old owner, had inherited the property from his father and expanded it significantly over 2 decades of meticulous administration. The plantation housed 127 slaves who worked from dawn to dusk. Carlton was known in the region as a strict but fair owner who maintained rigorous discipline among his slaves. He actively participated in the plantation's daily operations, frequently supervising the fieldwork personally. His reputation as a competent administrator had earned him respect among other owners and regional merchants. Blake Ross, Carlton's only son at 28 years old, had recently returned from his studies in Charleston, where he had learned modern agricultural techniques. Blake showed interest in gradually assuming more responsibilities on the plantation, although he occasionally expressed frustration with his father's traditional methods. The tensions between father and son were subtle but perceptible. The main house was an imposing 2-story structure with white columns characteristic of Southern style. The slave quarters, located at a respectful distance, housed slave families in simple but functional structures. Henderson and Murphy, the hired overseers, supervised daily work with efficiency recognized by Carlton. Patience, a 45-year-old enslaved woman, served as head housekeeper, supervising domestic activities. She had worked for the Ross family for more than 20 years and was considered one of the most reliable slaves on the property. Patience intimately knew the routines and personalities of both Carlton and Blake. Anthony was a 32-year-old slave, known for his exceptional physical strength and blacksmith skills. He had been purchased by Carlton 5 years earlier and quickly established himself as one of the plantation's most valuable workers. His imposing presence and professional competence made him respected by both other slaves and overseers. David, a 24-year-old young slave, worked mainly in the cotton fields, but was occasionally called for tasks requiring agility. He was known for his nervous nature and tendency to startle easily. David had developed a close friendship with Anthony, who frequently protected him from excessive punishments. Vincent Chambers was a neighboring plantation owner and close friend of Carlton Ross. At 48 years old, Chambers owned a smaller but equally prosperous property located approximately 5 miles north. He frequently visited Carlton to discuss commercial matters and coordinate regional efforts. Relations between Carlton and Blake had become tense in the months prior to March 1847. Blake had proposed various modernizations in operations, including new equipment and cultivation techniques. Carlton, while recognizing the merit of some suggestions, was reluctant to implement changes that might disrupt established systems. Carlton had developed the habit of conducting training sessions with selected slaves in the plantation's main barn. These sessions, which occurred several nights per week, were described as physical exercises intended to keep slaves disciplined. Blake occasionally participated, although he seemed uncomfortable with some aspects of his father's methods. Anthony and David were regular participants in Carlton's sessions. Anthony, due to his physical strength, was frequently used as an example of the importance of maintaining adequate conditioning. David was included as part of what Carlton described as character and discipline development. The sessions had become more intense in recent months, with Carlton implementing more rigorous exercises and competitions among participants. Some slaves expressed nervousness, but none dared question Carlton's decisions. The exact nature of these activities was known only to those directly involved. Patients had noticed subtle changes in both men's behavior in the preceding weeks. Carlton seemed more agitated, frequently working late and receiving visitors at unusual hours. Blake had become more reserved, spending long periods alone and avoiding prolonged conversations with his father. Vincent Chambers had increased the frequency of his visits during the winter of 1846 to 1847. These visits frequently extended late into the night, with private conversations in Carlton's office. When questioned, Carlton described them vaguely as discussions about commercial opportunities. The local community considered the Ross family an example of success in the plantation system. Carlton was respected for his commercial competence and participation in civic organizations. Blake was seen as a promising young man who would eventually assume leadership of the family property. However, behind this facade of normalcy, tensions were accumulating that would soon explode into violence. The events that would unfold on the night of March 15, 1847, would reveal that not everything at the Ross plantation was as it seemed, and that dark secrets were hidden behind the superficial respectability. Anthony had expressed growing concerns about the sessions to some close slaves, although he was careful not to be heard by overseers. He had noticed that these sessions were becoming more physical and competitive, with Carlton showing growing interest in testing participants' limits. David had become even more nervous in the preceding weeks, frequently startling at unexpected noises and showing reluctance to participate in sessions. Other slaves had noticed his growing anxiety, but attributed it to his naturally nervous nature. Blake had begun spending more time supervising field operations, trying to familiarize himself more intimately with all aspects of administration. He showed particular interest in getting to know individual slaves better, their abilities and personalities, an approach that differed from his father's more distant style. It was a period of deceptive calm that would precede one of the most violent nights in the property's history. Routines continued normally during the first days of March, without obvious indications of the dramatic events that were to come. The night of March 15, 1847, began like many others at the Ross plantation, with daily activities coming to an end and slaves returning to their quarters. Carlton had announced during dinner that he would conduct a training session in the main barn, a routine occurrence. Blake expressed interest in participating, although patients noticed unusual tension in his voice. The main barn was a substantial structure located approximately 200 yards from the main house. In recent months, Carlton had modified a section, removing equipment to create an open space suitable for his sessions. The interior was illuminated by several oil lanterns that created dancing shadows on the wooden walls. Anthony and David were instructed to present themselves at 8 o'clock in the evening. Anthony arrived punctually, his imposing physical presence even more pronounced in the dim lantern light. David arrived a few minutes later, visibly nervous and avoiding direct eye contact with Carlton. Blake was present when the slaves arrived. Carlton had established a specific routine, beginning with warm-up exercises, followed by strength and endurance competitions among participants. On this particular night, he seemed more animated than normal, explaining that he had planned special exercises that would truly test the slaves' capabilities. Anthony and David exchanged nervous glances. At approximately 8:30, Henderson arrived at the barn to inform Carlton about a disturbance in the slave quarters requiring immediate attention. 2 slaves had become involved in a discussion about food rations that had escalated to physical altercation. The situation was intensifying and other slaves were taking sides. Carlton showed irritation at the interruption, but recognized the importance of resolving the situation before it could spread. He instructed Blake to accompany him, explaining it would be a good opportunity to demonstrate leadership skills. Blake agreed, although he seemed reluctant to leave the training session in the middle of exercises. Carlton ordered Henderson and Murphy to accompany both him and Blake to ensure sufficient authority. He instructed Anthony and David to remain in the barn and continue with basic exercises until his return. Carlton estimated that resolving the disturbance would take approximately 20 to 30 minutes. Anthony and David were left alone, the atmosphere immediately becoming more tense. Anthony had noticed that David was particularly agitated this night. When Anthony asked about his state, David initially hesitated but then began revealing shocking information. David explained that Blake had approached him several times in recent weeks, initiating conversations about changes that would come when he assumed control of the plantation. Blake had painted a picture of opportunities and improvements, suggesting that those who supported him would be rewarded. David admitted being initially skeptical, but Blake had become more specific. Anthony was alarmed when David revealed that Blake had suggested Carlton was an obstacle to the improvements he wanted to implement. Blake had expressed frustration with his father's reluctance to modernize operations and had insinuated that dramatic changes would be necessary. David explained that Blake had begun talking about scenarios where Carlton would no longer be present. The most shocking revelation came when David admitted that Blake had proposed a specific plan to eliminate Carlton during a training session. Blake had explained that the death could be presented as a tragic accident, especially if it appeared that Carlton had been attacked by rebellious slaves. Blake had promised freedom for both in exchange for cooperation. Anthony initially refused to believe that Blake would be capable of such betrayal. However, David provided specific details about conversations, including precise descriptions of how the plan would be executed and how they would escape consequences. Blake had assured that he had allies who would help them flee after the accident. David explained that Blake had chosen this specific night because he had arranged the slave quarter disturbance as a distraction to ensure he and the overseers would leave the barn at the crucial moment. Blake had instructed David on exactly when and how to attack Carlton. The plan was for both to attack simultaneously, making it appear like a spontaneous rebellion. Anthony was horrified, but also realized they were in an extremely dangerous situation. If Blake had really orchestrated these events, then they were being manipulated to commit murder. Anthony tried to convince David to flee immediately, but David explained that Blake had threatened severe consequences if they didn't follow the plan. The conversation was interrupted by sounds of approaching footsteps. David entered total panic, assuming Carlton was returning and they would have to proceed with Blake's plan. Anthony tried to calm David, but the tension had become unbearable. David was visibly trembling, terrified by the implications. When Carlton entered alone, explaining that Blake and the overseers were still dealing with the situation, David interpreted this as the signal to proceed. Anthony tried to intervene, but David had already moved toward Carlton, determined to follow Blake's instructions. The situation escalated rapidly beyond control. Carlton, surprised by David's sudden aggressiveness, tried to defend himself but was quickly overpowered by the combined force. Anthony, although reluctant, was forced to participate when Carlton screamed for help. Realizing that his own survival depended on silencing Carlton before others arrived. The fight was brutal and quick, resulting in death from severe cranial trauma. David, immediately after Carlton's death, entered complete panic about the consequences. He realized he had committed murder based only on Blake's promises and had no guarantees that Blake would honor his commitments. Anthony tried to calm David, but the reality of the situation had become clear. They had killed the plantation owner and would face severe consequences if captured. David decided to flee immediately, convinced that remaining would result in certain execution. Anthony tried to persuade David to stay and face consequences together, arguing that fleeing would only confirm their guilt. However, David was beyond reason, dominated by terror. He ran to the back exit and disappeared into the darkness. Anthony remained with Carlton's body, trying to process the events. He realized he had been manipulated by Blake to commit a heinous crime, but also knew that no one would believe his version. Anthony was contemplating his limited options when he heard footsteps approaching again. Blake entered alone, claiming to have resolved the situation and returned to continue the session. His reaction to discovering the body was apparently shocked, but Anthony noticed something in Blake's eyes that made him suspect Blake wasn't genuinely surprised. Blake quickly took control, instructing Anthony to explain exactly what had happened. Anthony tried to explain about David's panic and how the situation had escalated, but Blake interrupted him, claiming they needed to act quickly to protect Anthony from consequences. Blake explained that death during a session would be seen as murder, and Anthony would be executed if the truth were discovered. Blake promised to protect Anthony if he cooperated. Blake quickly developed a story where Anthony had attacked Carlton in rebellion, and Blake had arrived in time to prevent escape. Blake explained he would claim to have killed Anthony in self-defense, protecting Anthony from execution while establishing Blake as a hero. Anthony, terrified and confused, reluctantly agreed. Blake then attacked Anthony with an iron bar, killing him quickly before Anthony could realize the betrayal. Blake carefully positioned the bodies to support his version, ensuring the scene appeared consistent with his story of discovering Carlton dead and killing Anthony in self-defense. Blake then screamed for help. Henderson and Murphy arrived quickly in response to the screams, finding Blake apparently in shock beside the two bodies. Blake explained his version convincingly, describing how he had discovered Anthony attacking Carlton and how he had acted instinctively to prevent the assassin's escape. The overseers immediately accepted the explanation, impressed by his courage. Subscribe to the channel to discover how Sheriff Jackson will investigate these events and what dark secrets he will uncover about the true nature of activities at the Ross Plantation. Sheriff Thomas Jackson arrived at the Ross Plantation in the early hours of March 16th, accompanied by Dr. Marcus Webb. Jackson had been awakened around midnight by Blake's messenger, who reported a murder followed by self-defense. During the ride, Jackson mentally prepared for an investigation that, based on the initial report, seemed relatively straightforward. Blake received Jackson on the main house porch, visibly shaken by the night's events. He explained that he had discovered his father dead in the barn, apparently murdered by Anthony during a training session. Blake reported that he had killed Anthony when the slave tried to flee the crime scene. His version was presented clearly and consistently. Jackson questioned Blake in detail about the sequence of events. Blake explained that he had left the barn to resolve a conflict in the slave quarters, taking the overseers with him. When he returned, he found Carlton dead and Anthony still present. Blake claimed to have acted on instinct to prevent his father's assassin from escaping justice. Henderson and Murphy confirmed Blake's version about the slave quarter conflict and his absence during the critical period. They reported hearing Blake scream for help and running to the barn, where they found both bodies. Their statements completely supported Blake's account of events. Jackson carefully examined the barn, documenting the position of bodies and physical evidence present. Carlton lay in the center of the training area, with severe head wounds and clear signs of violent struggle. Anthony was near the barn entrance, also with fatal wounds that seemed consistent with Blake's claim of self-defense. Dr. Webb examined both bodies, confirming that Carlton had died due to severe cranial trauma, probably caused by repeated blows. Anthony's wounds were consistent with blows from a heavy tool, possibly the same iron bar that Blake claimed to have used to stop him. Jackson noticed signs that someone had fled from the barn, footprints in the dirt near the back entrance and vegetation disturbances suggesting rapid movement. Blake explained that David had also been present during the training session and had fled when violence began. Jackson ordered an immediate search for David throughout the property. The search for David involved all available overseers and several trusted slaves. They systematically searched every building, field, and forest area of the plantation. Footprints were found leading away from the property, suggesting David had left the Ross plantation during the night. Jackson expanded the search to neighboring properties. Patience was questioned about her observations from the previous night. She confirmed hearing sounds from the barn, but explained this was normal during Carlton's training sessions. Patients reported noticing nothing unusual until hearing Blake screaming for help. Her statement supported the chronology presented by Blake. Other slaves were questioned about David and Anthony, their personalities and recent behaviors. Most described Anthony as a strong but generally obedient worker, although some mentioned he occasionally seemed tense after training sessions. David was described as nervous and prone to startling easily. Jackson began forming a theory based on available evidence. It appeared that Carlton was conducting a session when something went wrong. Possibly, Anthony had rebelled against Carlton, resulting in the owner's death. David, terrified by consequences, had fled, leaving Anthony to face Blake alone. Blake provided information about his father's sessions, explaining that Carlton believed intense physical exercises kept slaves disciplined and productive. Blake admitted these sessions sometimes became more intense than necessary, but insisted he had never witnessed real violence before the previous night. Jackson questioned Blake about his decision to kill Anthony instead of trying to capture him alive. Blake explained he was in shock at discovering his father's body and acted on instinct when he saw Anthony trying to flee. He expressed regret for not attempting to capture Anthony alive, but insisted his actions were justified. Dr. Webb completed his examinations and confirmed both deaths had occurred during the previous night, consistent with Blake's chronology. He noted that Carlton's wounds suggested a prolonged and violent attack, while Anthony's wounds were more consistent with quick defensive blows. Jackson decided the evidence supported Blake's version. Although he regretted that Anthony couldn't be questioned about his motives, the physical evidence and witness statements created a consistent picture. Jackson officially classified Carlton's death as murder by Anthony and Anthony's death as self-defense by Blake. The search for David continued throughout the following day, but without success. Jackson issued an arrest warrant for David as an accomplice in Carlton's murder, based on his presence at the scene and subsequent flight. Posters were distributed in neighboring towns with David's description, offering a reward for information. Blake began assuming total control of the Ross plantation, making decisions about daily operations and future planning. He expressed determination to honor his father's memory by keeping the property prosperous. The slaves cautiously observed the leadership changes, uncertain about how Blake would conduct operations. Vincent Chambers visited the plantation 2 days after the tragedy to express condolences and offer assistance during the transition period. Blake thanked Chambers for his support and indicated he valued his continued friendship and advice. Chambers seemed genuinely shocked by events and offered any necessary help. Jackson concluded his initial investigation by classifying the case as resolved, although David's capture remained a priority. He praised Blake for his courageous actions in a terrible situation and expressed confidence that David would eventually be captured and brought to justice. The official report completely supported Blake's version of events. The local community reacted to events with shock and sympathy for Blake. Neighbors visited to offer condolences and practical assistance during the mourning period. Carlton's violent death was seen as a reminder of the inherent dangers in plantation management and the importance of maintaining rigorous discipline among slaves. Blake organized an appropriate funeral for Carlton, which was well attended by local owners and community members. During the service, Blake spoke about his father's legacy and his determination to continue building on established foundations. His presentation was seen as dignified and appropriate to circumstances. In the weeks following the funeral, Blake implemented gradual changes in plantation administration. He modified some of his father's more severe practices, including suspending training sessions in the barn. Blake explained these changes as necessary to prevent future incidents and maintain order on the property. The investigation into David's whereabouts continued, but without significant results. Occasional sighting reports arrived from various directions, but none led to capture. Jackson began suspecting that David had managed to leave the region completely, possibly heading to northern states. Blake quickly established himself in his new role as sole owner. He demonstrated administrative competence and maintained cordial relations with neighbors and local authorities. To external observers, Blake seemed to be handling well the inherited responsibilities and tragic circumstances that had created them. 3 weeks after classifying the case as resolved, Jackson began receiving disturbing information that forced him to reopen his investigation. A merchant from a neighboring town approached Jackson with reports about suspicious activities involving local owners, including rumors about betting on competitions involving slaves. Jackson initially dismissed these rumors as gossip, but the persistence of reports and specificity of some details intrigued him. The merchant mentioned hearing conversations about large sums being bet on events occurring at rural properties during nights. Although reluctant to investigate community members, Jackson decided to discreetly explore these allegations. The investigation began with a review of financial records from various regional plantations. Jackson noticed unusual patterns in Carlton Ross's bank deposits that didn't correspond to typical agricultural production cycles. Regular and substantial deposits occurred monthly, suggesting an additional income source not declared. Jackson expanded his investigation to include other owners mentioned in rumors. Vincent Chambers, in particular, showed financial patterns similar to Carlton's. When Jackson examined Chambers's bank records more thoroughly, he discovered regular transfers between Chambers's and Carlton's accounts, suggesting an undocumented commercial partnership. Jackson decided to confront Chambers directly about these suspicious transactions. Initially, Chambers tried to explain the transfers as personal loans or agricultural commodity investments. However, when Jackson pressed for specific documentation, Chambers became evasive and clearly uncomfortable. Under growing pressure, Chambers finally admitted being involved in activities beyond traditional agriculture. He reluctantly revealed that Carlton had organized special entertainment for local owners and wealthy visitors. These sessions involved competitions between slaves, with significant betting by spectators. Chambers tried to minimize the nature of these activities, describing them as competitive exercises that kept slaves in physical shape. However, when Jackson pressed for specific details, the brutal truth emerged. Carlton had forced slaves to fight each other for entertainment of wealthy white men, essentially operating an illegal business of betting on human combat. Jackson realized that Carlton Ross, a respected community member, had been operating a particularly cruel form of exploitation that went far beyond slavery's already brutal practices. The training sessions in the barn were actually preparation for these forced fights. Jackson discovered that the illegal entertainment network extended across several regional plantations. Owners, local merchants, and even some public officials had regularly participated in these brutal sessions. The money involved was substantial, with some individual bets reaching hundreds of dollars per fight. Chambers revealed that Carlton had become increasingly reckless in his operations, organizing more frequent and violent fights to satisfy spectators' growing demand. Some network members had expressed concerns about operation sustainability and exposure risk, but Carlton had ignored these warnings. Jackson obtained a search warrant to examine the Ross plantation more thoroughly, this time specifically looking for evidence of Carlton's illegal activities. The search revealed hidden records detailing bets, participant lists, and performance statistics for individual slaves. These documents were hidden in a secret compartment in Carlton's office. During the meticulous search of Carlton's hidden records, Jackson made a discovery that left him physically nauseated. The documents detailed not only bets and participants, but also a macabre record of fatalities. The record showed that over 5 years of operation, 12 slaves had died during forced fights. Carlton had meticulously documented each death, including names, dates, and even descriptions of fatal injuries. Some deaths were listed as training accidents, but the frequency and nature of wounds revealed the truth about these competitions. Carlton had gradually escalated fight violence to satisfy increasingly sadistic spectators. Jackson found physical evidence of deaths on the property itself. An isolated area at the plantation's rear contained unmarked graves where dead slaves had been secretly buried. Carlton had instructed that deaths be officially registered as diseases or work accidents to avoid suspicion about the true cause. During his expanded investigation, Jackson received a report that David had been sighted at an abandoned property approximately 20 miles south of the Ross plantation. Jackson discreetly organized an operation to capture David, keeping information restricted to only his most trusted deputies. David's capture occurred without incident. David was visibly exhausted and malnourished after weeks of fleeing and offered little resistance when confronted by Jackson's deputies. Jackson decided to keep the capture secret, only reporting that the investigation into Carlton's illegal activities was progressing. Jackson extensively questioned David about his participation in forced fights and the events of March 15th. David confirmed that he and Anthony had been forced to fight regularly for Carlton's visitors' entertainment. He described the brutality of these sessions and the constant fear he and other slaves felt. David then revealed information that completely changed Jackson's understanding of Carlton's death. He explained that Anthony had told him about secret conversations with Blake Ross in the weeks before Carlton's death. According to David, Anthony had revealed that Blake was planning something that would change their lives forever. Anthony had told David that Blake had approached him with a shocking proposal. Blake had expressed desire to assume plantation control and eliminate his father, whom he saw as an obstacle to his own plans. Blake had promised freedom to both Anthony and David in exchange for their cooperation in a plan to kill Carlton. David explained that Anthony had initially been skeptical about Blake's promises, but had gradually become convinced that cooperating was his only chance to escape the forced fight's brutality. Anthony had shared the plan's details with David, including how Blake would organize a distraction to ensure they were alone with Carlton. According to David, the original plan was for both he and Anthony to attack Carlton simultaneously during the training session, making it appear the death had resulted from spontaneous rebellion. Blake would then discover the body and claim he had killed the rebellious slaves in self-defense, inheriting the plantation without suspicion. David admitted he had reluctantly agreed to the plan, motivated mainly by fear of refusal consequences and the promise of freedom. However, when the crucial moment came on the night of March 15th, David entered total panic and fled before he could participate in the murder, leaving Anthony to face Carlton alone. Jackson realized that David's revelations perfectly explained the fatal night's events. Blake had deliberately created the opportunity for Anthony to kill Carlton, but when David fled, the plan had become complicated. Blake had then improvised, killing Anthony to eliminate the only witness who could reveal his participation in the conspiracy. Jackson kept David in secure custody while developing his strategy to confront Blake. He knew that accusing Blake Ross of patricide would be extremely controversial and needed a careful approach. Jackson decided to use his investigation into illegal betting as initial pretext to confront Blake. On the morning of April 8, 1847, Jackson rode to the Ross plantation with 2 deputies, ostensibly to discuss routine matters related to the ongoing investigation. Blake received Jackson cordially, assuming the visit was related to the continued search for David or minor administrative matters. Jackson began the conversation discussing the investigation into Carlton's illegal activities, carefully observing Blake's reactions. When Jackson mentioned betting on forced fights, Blake showed clear signs of prior knowledge, confirming Jackson's suspicions that Blake was aware of his father's activities. Jackson then revealed the extent of his investigation, including financial records, correspondence, and testimonies he had collected. Blake tried to maintain composure, but Jackson noticed growing signs of nervousness. When Jackson mentioned he would have to arrest Blake for participation in illegal activities, Blake protested his innocence. Jackson then revealed his most devastating discovery. He knew Blake had conspired to murder his own father. Blake's reaction was genuine shock, not at the accusation itself, but at Jackson's discovery of the conspiracy. Blake asked how Jackson could know about something so specific, inadvertently revealing his knowledge of events. Jackson calmly explained that he had captured David several days earlier, and that David had revealed everything about the plan Anthony had told him. Blake immediately realized that his carefully constructed version of events was crumbling, and that Jackson had discovered the truth about his participation in Carlton's murder. Blake's inadvertent confession about his knowledge of specific events sealed his fate. Jackson immediately ordered his deputies to arrest Blake Ross for conspiracy to commit murder and first-degree murder of Carlton Ross. Blake tried to regain his composure and deny the accusations, but the damage was done. His reaction had confirmed that he knew details only the true conspirator could know. Blake was taken to the county jail under heavy escort, while Jackson assumed temporary control of the Ross plantation to preserve evidence and maintain order among the slaves. News of Blake's arrest spread rapidly through the community, causing shock and disbelief among neighbors who had sympathized with him as a victim of tragic circumstances. Vincent Chambers was arrested as an accomplice in illegal betting operations, although Jackson found no evidence that Chambers knew about Blake's assassination plan. Chambers cooperated fully with the investigation, providing names of other participants in the forced fighting network in exchange for consideration during his own trial. The investigation revealed that the illegal entertainment network had operated for more than 2 years, involving at least 12 different plantations and generating substantial profits for organizers. Jackson discovered that Carlton had been one of the network's founders, using his reputation to attract high-class participants and protect operations from official scrutiny. David was kept in protective custody as the main witness against Blake. Jackson knew David's testimony would be crucial to the case, but also recognized the monumental legal challenges of using a slave as witness against a white man in an Alabama court in 1847. Jackson worked with prosecutors to develop a strategy that maximized the impact of physical evidence. Blake Ross's trial began in June 1847, attracting significant attention from throughout the region. The community was divided between those who believed the evidence against Blake and others who refused to accept that a local society member could be guilty of patricide. The courtroom was packed daily with curious spectators and press members. The prosecutor presented a meticulous case based on physical evidence, financial records of illegal betting, discovery of 12 deaths, and Chambers' testimony about brutal activities. Evidence about illegal operations was overwhelming and indisputable. However, when it came time to prove Carlton's murder, the case depended crucially on David's testimony. David testified for 2 complete days, describing in detail the conversations Anthony had shared with him about Blake's plan. Despite the specificity and consistency of his account, Blake's defense relentlessly attacked David's credibility, repeatedly reminding the jury that he was a fugitive slave trying to reduce his own culpability. The defense attorney eloquently argued that accepting a slave's testimony against a respected white man would establish a dangerous precedent that would threaten social order. He painted David as a desperate liar willing to say anything to escape punishment for his own participation in Carlton's murder. Jackson testified about his investigation, presenting physical evidence that supported David's version of events. He explained inconsistencies in Blake's original version and how discovery of illegal activities had led to revelation of the conspiracy. However, Jackson perceived that the jury was clearly uncomfortable with the idea of convicting a white man based primarily on a slave's testimony. Chambers testified about Carlton's illegal activities, confirming that Blake was aware of operations and had expressed interest in assuming control. However, Chambers carefully avoided confirming specific details about any assassination plan, claiming he had never heard Blake make explicit statements about killing his father. The jury deliberated for 2 complete days before returning with a verdict that shocked Jackson, although it didn't completely surprise him. Blake was found guilty of organizing illegal betting and complicity in the deaths of 12 slaves during forced fights. However, the jury declared there was insufficient evidence to sustain murder charges against Carlton Ross. Blake was sentenced to 8 months in prison for his illegal activities and a substantial fine. The judge expressed deep concern about murder allegations but agreed that David's testimony, although detailed, didn't meet legal standards necessary for murder conviction when not corroborated by reliable white witnesses. Jackson watched with growing revulsion as Blake accepted his sentence with almost arrogant composure. Blake expressed regret for allowing his father's illegal activities to continue and promised to completely reform plantation operations. He maintained absolute innocence on murder charges, claiming to be victim of a malicious conspiracy. David faced a very different fate. Although his testimony hadn't resulted in Blake's conviction for murder, he was still technically guilty of participating in the conspiracy to kill Carlton. Jackson worked discreetly to arrange David's escape from custody during a transfer, allowing him to flee to Northern Territories before he could be formally sentenced. Vincent Chambers received a 2-year prison sentence for his participation in illegal betting operations, significantly more severe than Blake's due to his role as principal organizer. Chambers served 18 months before being released, but his community reputation was permanently destroyed. He left the region immediately after his release. Blake returned to the Ross plantation after serving only 6 months of his 8-month sentence, receiving reduction for good behavior and cooperation with authorities. He reassumed total control of the property and quickly implemented changes that, superficially, appeared to be reforms, but Jackson suspected were mainly cosmetic. Jackson continued discreetly monitoring activities at the Ross plantation, but Blake had become much more cautious in his operations. Training sessions in the barn ceased completely, and Blake adopted a public stance as a reformed owner committed to more humane practices. However, Jackson occasionally received reports about suspicious activities. The community gradually accepted Blake back as a society member, especially after he made substantial donations to the local church and charitable organizations. Many neighbors expressed admiration for his recovery from tragic circumstances and his apparent dedication to reform. Jackson observed this social rehabilitation with growing cynicism. Patients and other domestic slaves discreetly reported to Jackson that Blake had become even more cruel and controlling after his return from prison. Although he avoided activities that might attract official attention, Blake apparently punished any slave he suspected of disloyalty with extreme severity. Jackson knew he couldn't act based only on rumors. Jackson maintained correspondence with authorities in northern states, discreetly monitoring reports about black men who might be David. Although he never officially confirmed it, Jackson received indications that David had managed to establish himself as a free man in Ohio, working as a carpenter and living under an assumed name. The verdict's injustice haunted Jackson daily. He knew with absolute moral certainty that Blake had orchestrated his own father's murder, but the legal system had failed to deliver justice due to deeply rooted racial prejudices. Jackson frequently reflected on how a black man's word, no matter how true, would never be accepted against a respected white man's. Jackson began fundamentally questioning the system he had sworn to defend. The Ross case clearly demonstrated how laws were structured to protect upper-class white men regardless of their actual guilt. Jackson saw how Blake had manipulated not only vulnerable slaves, but also the legal system itself to escape consequences for his crimes. Years later, Jackson occasionally received letters from a carpenter in Ohio who signed only as DF. The letters never mentioned specific events, but expressed gratitude for justice attempts in ways Jackson understood perfectly. Jackson kept these letters as reminders that sometimes even sincere justice attempts failed due to corrupted systems. Blake continued operating the Ross plantation for the following decades, eventually expanding his properties and becoming an even more prominent community figure. He married another plantation owner's daughter and had several children, establishing a dynasty that would last generations. Jackson observed this continued prosperity with growing bitterness. Discovery of the 12 unmarked graves became public knowledge during the trial, but the community quickly minimized their significance. Many argued that deaths during training were unfortunately common, and that Carlton had been excessively zealous, but not necessarily criminal in his practices. Jackson was horrified by the ease with which the community rationalized these deaths. Jackson frequently visited discreetly the unmarked graves at the plantation's rear, reflecting on lost lives and the injustice that allowed their murderers to escape adequate punishment. He occasionally left wildflowers at the sites, a small but significant gesture of recognition for those forgotten by the legal system. The Ross case became a turning point in Jackson's career, transforming him from a confident law enforcer into a bitter skeptic about the legal system's capacity to deliver true justice. Jackson continued serving as sheriff for 10 more years, but never recovered his previous faith in law's impartiality. Jackson developed a reputation as a discreet slave advocate, occasionally losing evidence in minor cases or allowing escapes during transfers. Although he could never correct the Ross case injustice, Jackson found small ways to use his position to protect those the legal system had abandoned. Decades later, when Jackson was near death, he wrote a detailed account of the Ross case, documenting all evidence he had collected and his absolute conviction about Blake's guilt. Jackson sealed this document with instructions for it to be opened only after Blake's death, hoping truth would eventually emerge, even if justice was never served. The Ross case legacy extended far beyond the immediate region, serving as a clear example of how the antebellum legal system protected privileged white men at the expense of true justice. For Jackson, the case remained a somber reminder that sometimes knowing the truth wasn't enough to ensure justice was done, especially when that truth challenged society's established power structures. The story of the Ross plantation remains as one of the most disturbing examples of how justice can fail when confronted with a society's deeply rooted prejudices. In 1847, in the heart of Alabama, a slave's word against a white man was worth absolutely nothing, regardless of the truth it contained. Jackson took to his grave the absolute certainty that Blake Ross had coldly orchestrated his own father's murder, manipulating desperate slaves with empty promises of freedom. 12 men had died brutally for wealthy owners' entertainment, their lives considered so disposable that their deaths were recorded as mere training accidents. What most haunted Jackson wasn't just the crime's cruelty, but the ease with which the legal system ignored them. Blake Ross not only escaped punishment for patricide, but prospered, expanded his properties, and became a community pillar. His brief prison stay was seen as sufficient penance for years of systematic brutality. David, the only survivor who knew the complete truth, was forced to live the rest of his life as a fugitive, assuming a false identity in distant lands. His courage in testifying against Blake was rewarded with permanent exile, and the knowledge that his truth had been rejected simply due to his skin color. The community that had sympathized with Blake as a victim of circumstances quickly forgot the disturbing evidence presented during the trial. The 12 unmarked graves were relegated to history, their victims forgotten as if they had never existed. Society's capacity to rationalize and forget atrocities when committed by their privileged members revealed a moral corruption that went far beyond Carlton and Blake Ross's individual crimes. Jackson frequently wondered how many other Blake Rosses existed, protected by their social position and skin color, free to perpetuate cycles of violence and exploitation without real consequences. The Ross case wasn't an aberration, but rather a faithful reflection of a system designed to protect some at the expense of many. In the following decades, while Blake Ross built his legacy of prosperity, the families of the 12 men who died in forced fights continued their lives without ever knowing their loved ones' real fate. They were told their husbands, sons, and brothers had died from diseases or accidents, carrying pain that could never be adequately processed because it was built on lies. The true tragedy of the Ross plantation doesn't reside only in the murders that occurred within its borders, but in the clear demonstration that American justice in 1847 was an illusion for those without power or privilege. The system that should protect the innocent and punish the guilty functioned only for those who already possessed social and economic advantages. Today, when we visit the places where these atrocities occurred, we must remember that history isn't just about past events, but about injustice patterns that echo through centuries. The Ross plantation serves as a somber reminder that knowing the truth isn't always enough to ensure justice is done, especially when that truth challenges established power structures. The question that remains isn't whether Blake Ross was guilty. The evidence was overwhelming. The question is, how many other truths were buried alongside those 12 men in unmarked graves? and how many similar injustices continue hidden in history's shadows, protected by the silence of those who benefited from fundamentally corrupted systems. The Ross Plantation's most lasting legacy may be the lesson that true justice requires more than evidence and testimony. It requires a society willing to confront its own moral failures and challenge the privileges that allow some to escape consequences for their most heinous crimes. If this story of injustice and corruption moved you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate notifications. Your subscription helps us continue sharing these tales that remind us how far we've come and how far we still need to go in the pursuit of true justice.